have some room for questions. I will notify speakers when 10 minutes have passed. And if you go over 15 minutes, I will stop you by muting you, basically. Regarding questions, if anybody has some questions, you can either type them in the chat on Zoom, or you can ask them directly over Zoom if there's time. Cool. So it is my pleasure to introduce the first speaker of today, Sean Kelly. I can see you are already actually sharing your screen. Oh, sorry, your camera's on. Please take it away.
Hey, thanks everyone for joining today. I have a pre-recorded talk, so I'm just going to share my screen now. Right. Good afternoon. My name is Sean Kelly. I'm a PhD student at Trinity College Dublin. Today I'm going to be talking to you about some of my recent work on within subject changes in network connectivity during an episode of depression. So depression has traditionally been thought of as a latent cause model in which depression causes a variety of symptoms, including problems with concentration, increases in fatigue, and sleep problems. And under this model, these symptoms are independent of each other. However, more recent work has posited that depression may be better explained as a network of symptoms. So in a network model of depression, there are interactions between the depressive symptoms, and these interactions cause the emergent phenomenon of depression. So for example, a loss of interest leads to more feeling down, leads to increased worrying and less social life engagement, such that positive feedback loops between symptoms lead to the maintenance of a depressive episode. So some of the predictions of network theory are that there will be increased connectivity in depression symptom networks among people with persistent depression. So for example, in people with depression in vulnerable networks, if you imagine these nodes as depressive symptoms, then if one symptom is activated, it is unlikely to lead to the activation of another symptom. However, in people with depression vulnerable networks, one symptom activating is very likely to lead to the activation of another symptom that can then cause a cascade of activation leading to the emergence of a depressive state. However, there has been recently some conflicting evidence around whether network connectivity is actually associated with depression severity. So several studies have found that there is an increase in network connectivity after treatment for depression. And this discrepancy could be due to the fact that most of these studies are based on cross-sectional data. So a way to resolve this is that we need to understand causal relations between symptoms. And to do that, we can look at sort of longitudinal within subject studies. However, these types of studies, otherwise known as ecological momentary assessment, are very time and labor intensive for participants. People need to rate symptoms several times a day over many weeks, and that leads to small sample sizes. Additionally, these studies typically aren't conducted over a long enough time frame to encompass the natural onset and termination of depressive episodes. And only 2 studies have conclusively shown evidence of increase in network connectivity prior to a depression onset. And both of these studies had sample sizes of 1. So what we were interested in is whether existing archival social media data can be used instead, and in particular, can Twitter be used as a proxy for ecological momentary assessment? And key to that assumption is that depressed individuals use language differently. So it's been conclusively shown that people with depression use more first-person singular pronouns. They use more I references, more self-reference, and they also use more negative emotions. This has been demonstrated consistently across a variety of text formats, social media posts, personal essays, as well as interviews. And these linguistic changes are very broad as well, so they encompass increases in swear words, negation words, anger words, as well as a variety of other categories. And crucially to this work, language use changes prior to the onset of a depressive episode. So the aims of this study were to compare within subject differences in network connectivity between and outside a naturally occurring depressive episode. And in that context, we were interested in whether network connectivity increases within an episode of depression in a sample size larger than 1, as well as the fact we were interested in whether network connectivity is associated with current depression severity. So moving on to some of the methods. Participants were asked to provide some basic demographic information such as age and gender. They completed a depression questionnaire related to current depression severity, as well as provided the dates of any depressive episodes in the past year. So a depressive episode was defined as at least a 2-week period of low mood or loss of interest and pleasure in activities. It was chosen to sort of maximize the sensitivity to detect a depressive episode. And participants also provided a Twitter handle from which we scraped tweets and likes from their Twitter account. And after applying a exclusion criterion of having at least 30 days of tweets, we ended up with 496 participants. The majority was female, with 66% female, an average age of about 30 years, and almost 90% was from either the UK or the US. And Twitter data is very noisy, as you can imagine. So once we get this data, we have to remove some extraneous information that could reduce our predictive ability. So we remove emojis, numbers, hashtags, and other non-alphanumeric characters. And then we take these tweets and group them together by day. So we do that in order to increase the amount of data which we can use to run text analysis. So for text analysis, we use the Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, or LIWC. So this is a well-validated library for psychological research where you input some text and it will output 90 different variables related to grammar and emotional content. And we were interested in particular 9 variables that were previously associated with depression by De Chowdhury et al. So these include negative emotions, so words like ugly, positive emotions like nice, first, second, and third person pronouns, swear words, articles like the, and negation words like not. So after we do that, we end up with a time series of those 9 variables for each participant in our study. And then we can move on to the process of constructing personalized networks. So in this analysis, different nodes are Twitter text features, and the edges between nodes are partial correlations. So green would mean a positive partial correlation and red a negative partial correlation. And then we were interested in particular in 2 measures. So one is the individual node strength, which is the sum of the absolute edges into a node, as well as global network connectivity, which was the mean across all the nodes in the network, sort of a measure of overall network vulnerability. And now moving on to the results. So the first question we asked was whether we could replicate significant associations just between mean text features over the past year and current depression severity, just to see if we were actually picking up on any signal in our data. So we were able to replicate 6 out of 9 associations previously found in the literature, including first person singular and plural pronouns, positive and negative emotions, swear and negation words. We weren't able to replicate associations for second and third person pronouns. And although we found a negative association with article use, there is some conflicting evidence around the exact direction of that association in the literature. So after we did that, we then looked at the association between individual and global network strength and current depression severity. So you can imagine depression on a continuum between low and high depression, and we would imagine that network connectivity is proportional to that. So people with high depression would have high network connectivity, people with low depression, low network connectivity. And that's exactly what we found. So we found that in people with greater symptom severity, there was elevated global network strength. And in particular, this was driven by increases in the node strength of articles, negative emotions, and swear words. And we noticed in a sort of mean personalized network across all participants, a strong positive association between swear words and negative emotions. And after that, we then looked at differences in individual and global network strength within and outside an episode of depression. So for each participant, we constructed 2 networks, one within an episode, one outside an episode, with the expectation that there would be elevated network connectivity within an episode. And again, that's what we were able to show. So within a depressive episode, there was significantly elevated global network strength, and this was driven by a broad increase among almost all nodes in the network. So 6 out of 9 nodes in the network had elevated individual node strength. And then sort of the final analysis we did is that we wanted to see how specific are these results to the a priori network that we selected. So the fact that we observed significant within episode connectivity could just be due solely to the fact that we chose these 9 text features, but it wouldn't generalize to other text features. So we constructed 1,000 networks from random subsets of 9 text features that were either significantly or not significantly associated with current depression severity. And then we compared the mean effect of within episode period on network connectivity between these 2 network types. So here in this graph, in the dark gray, we have depression irrelevant networks. So networks constructed from text features not associated with current depression. And in light gray, a depression relevant network. So networks constructed from text features associated with current depression severity. And what we found is that there's a significant increase in within episode connectivity for networks constructed from depression relevant features. And in this dashed blue line, what we can see is that our network, this is our network, and it is performing among one of the best performing networks. So from this, we were able to conclude that we were confirming 2 of the central predictions of network theory. One, that there was significant association between global network strength and current depression severity, as well as a significant increase in global network connectivity within versus outside a depressive episode. Our results were not specific to the a priori 9 text features we selected, but rather a more general characteristic of networks with depression relevant features. Ours was the first study to construct personalized networks from Twitter and is thus a promising method for testing some of the more difficult network theory predictions. So thank you very much. I would just like to thank in particular my supervisor, Dr. Claire Gillen. If you have any further questions, I'm happy to answer them now, or you can email me here. And this is the link to our preprint where you can read about the study results in more detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sean. Any questions?
I have a, okay.
There's a question in the chat, Sean, and then we have one from Susanna afterwards.
Yep, so in healthy episodes, you find stronger network connectivity if the nodes are health-related texts. So we didn't look at anything text that was sort of health-related. In particular, the text was sort of from a general Twitter sample. So I wouldn't exactly know the answer to that question.
And then Susanna's, you had a question as well.
I have like everyday questions. Since I'm also using Twitter. Did you look at how the mere presence of Twitter changes the depression? So the severity or the frequency of depression? Because I mean, when you were speaking, I was thinking like just being on Twitter probably makes everyone depressed. So, but did you look at that as a variable?
Yeah, so it wasn't included in the network analysis, but people who have sort of more frequent Twitter use, I believe, are sort of more prone to depression. So I'm not sure whether the causal relationship that, Twitter makes you depressed, or just people who happen to be depressed are also more likely to tweet about it. So we also had some participants who were recruited through Twitter. And that was primarily through sort of mental health influencer accounts. So that was kind of people who are particularly prone to depression and also were talking about it themselves on Twitter.
Okay, thank you. It is very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. There is also one more question, but we have no more time to answer that. So Sean, you can maybe just type in the chat your response to that.
Sure.
And I just want to thank you again, Sean. It's a bit strange just clapping alone. So next in line is Sandip. Please go ahead. Sandip, you're on mute as well.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm Sandip. I'm from the University Medical Center at Groningen. And today I'll be talking about understanding the complexity of recurrences in the movement data of depressed individuals. This work has been done in collaboration with my group, the Transit team. Let me quickly just talk about what is major depressive disorder. So it's a mood disorder that is characterized by persistent feelings of sadness, hopelessness, loss of interest, among other symptoms. And it is a leading cause of disability in the world. One of the diagnostic criteria for depression is a reduction in physical activity. And that is the aspect that we will explore in this talk. We know that the pure levels of physical activity is actually less in depressed people. And depressed people also have a more disturbed circadian rhythm than the non-depressed people. One way to measure this is using accelerometer units in these smartwatches, and that will give you the actual levels of physical activity. The useful thing about this is that this can be measured with low patient burden, it has high sampling frequency, and so on. The question we will address in this talk is beyond this mean physical activity are more complex measures, more representative of the complexity of movement. And to do this, we use this tool called as recurrence plots, which actually looks at patterns of recurrences in a time series. And the question is whether this provides insights into the dynamics of this particular system. So how do we really generate a recurrence plot? So you have a time series, like the one in A, and then every point on this is an index. And then you take a small band around this of size epsilon. And then every time series point in the future and the past that falls within a range, this range epsilon, that is falls within this red band, is marked with a dark spot. And if it falls outside it, it's marked with a light spot, right? And when you do this for all points, you get an n into n matrix. And that is what we call a recurrence plot. Now, you can quantify this recurrence plot using the horizontal lines that are present in it and the diagonal lines that are present in it. The horizontal lines are representative of the laminar states. And this can be quantified using three measures: the laminarity, the average horizontal line length, and the entropy of the horizontal line distribution. And similarly, for the diagonal lines, you have a determinism measure, you have the average of the diagonal line lengths, and you have the entropy of the distribution. So the question that we ask specifically is, what are the differences in recurrent physical activity that depression produces? And we can actually split this into two questions. We have a group level question and an individual level question. The group level question is whether the patterns of recurrence in physical activity actually differ between the depressed and non-depressed. And if this actually happens, then we can go to the individual level question, which is whether this change occurs prior to an episode at an individual level. To answer the first question, that is a group level question, the study we use is the MOVED study, where the activity of 25 depressed and non-depressed individuals were tracked for a month. Interestingly, in this study, we found that there were no significant differences in the mean physical activity. Further, we found out that there was no correlation between the mean physical activity and the recurrence-based quantifiers that we use either. So I'll go straight ahead and show you the results. First, the recurrence plots of the depressed and the non-depressed groups. So these are two particular individuals, and on the plot on the left, A, is actually the recurrence plot from a healthy, a non-depressed individual. And the plot on the right is from a depressed individual. And immediately you can see visually that there are differences. For instance, you can see the plot on the right is more noisy, seems to be, and hence seems to be less complex than the plot on the left. And indeed, we see that we can find significant differences in at least two of the quantifiers, that is the average and the entropy of the diagonal line length distribution. And I'll show you these distributions across the healthy and the depressed group in the next plot. So over here, the orange actually is a depressed group and the blue is the healthy group. And this is A is the average line, average of the diagonal line, the average of the diagonal line, the distribution over all healthy and all depressed people. And the middle one, B, is the entropy. And the last is the ratio of the laminarity to determinism. And so what this actually implies is that non-depressed individuals seem to show a greater duration of recurrent physical activity patterns and a greater diversity in these recurrent physical activity patterns. So further, we could also show that the recurrence quantifiers could predict the depression status much better than the mean physical activity. Then we come to the individual level question. And to do this, we use data from the transit tapering project. So in this project, individuals who are tapering medication and hence at increased risk for depression were followed for 6 months. The mood items were measured 5 times daily. The heart rate was measured twice daily. And the activity was measured, that's the physical activity was measured every minute. The question of whether the mean and the circadian rhythm shifts prior to a depressive episode is being analyzed separately by my collaborator, Yoram Kunkels. The question I will address is whether the recurrence quantification analysis measures can actually predict these episodes. So to detect these transitions, we use a sliding window technique. And what we do is we take a time series of 8 weeks of actigraphy prior to a depressive transition. And then we estimate the recurrence plot within the first 2 weeks. So we take 2 weeks of data and we find the first 2 weeks of data. We estimate the recurrence plot. We calculate the parameters of the recurrence plot. And then we shift forward by some Q points, in my case by about 20 points. And then we calculate the recurrence plot and the parameters again, right? And we keep shifting this. And we end up with a time series of each recurrence plot quantifier, something like you can see in these figures. And we look whether this time series has any trends in time. This time series are the quantifiers. So we look for something like on the left over here, where the laminarity is plotted as a moving window over time. And you can see a clear trend in this person. And not for something on the right, like over here, again, we plot the laminarity determinism ratio, and we see that there is no significant trend over time. So now I present some preliminary results from this study. This is still ongoing. So these are the first 10 patients who we've analyzed. And the blue over here represents that we found a significant trend over time. And we can see that that overall, that we find trends in at least one of the quantifiers for 8 out of 10 patients. We also know that we can also find out immediately that the laminarity and the determinism seem to perform much better than many of the other quantifiers. In fact, the laminarity has predicts about 70% of transitions in this really small sample, and determinism about 60%. Right. So then these are the results that we have. Laminarity and determinism were the most commonly found signals. 8 out of 10 individuals showed warning signals, and we find that both. This is a slight difference from the group level analysis. We find that there are both significant increases and decreases that were observed. What they seem to suggest that it is a deviation from a rhythm that is more important than the actual absolute increase or a decrease. The part that we have not analyzed so far is a question of specificity. And to do this, what we plan to do is that we plan to repeat this analysis with sliding windows, but prior to a dummy transition. That is when there is no real transition in the data. And then the question we need to check there is that we need to check that there are no significant trends that arise over time. And this will answer the specificity question. So now I come to the end of the talk, and the takeaways from this was that we find that depressed individuals show a lower duration and diversity of recurrent physical activity. The recurrence-based measures shows little correlation with the mean levels and even the circadian rhythm variables, and actually predicted the depression status better. And finally, from the transit project, we could show that it shows promise as predictors for depressive episodes, at least in our preliminary results. So finally, I'd like to acknowledge the transit team. This is the group with which this work is being done. Different individuals in this group are doing different aspects of trying to find transitions towards depression. You can visit our website at transit.nl and you can find our upcoming publications. There are many exciting works that will come up. If you have any questions that arise after and you can't address them right now, please send me an email. My email is right here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions? I think there's one in the chat from Taha. Can you read it or should I read it for you?
Could you read it? That'd be great.
A basic question. Is lower physical activity a cause or a symptom?
Yeah, it's that's the way at least that the one should think about it, I think, is that it's probably a two-way interaction. It's not really clear. There have been studies from both sides whether lower physical activity is a cause of depression or whether depression causes lower physical activity. At this point, as far as I understand, it's not clear, and it's probably true that the interactions happen both ways. So if you are feeling low, for instance, and if you do more physical activity, your mood is likely to improve. But at the same time, if your mood is low, you're likely to do less physical activity. So probably like a two-way interaction.
Cool. Any other questions? Otherwise, I have one. This is a really cool idea with the recurrence patterns. Mm-hmm. What's the next step? Where are you going from here?
Of course, the long-term plan is, of course, if we can try and make this detection real time. And to do that, we need to answer the specificity question. For instance, if we find these increases everywhere, then it makes no sense to look any further. So, however, if these are actually going to work, then maybe you could even think about looking at some kind of measure of the actigraphy from the recurrence plots, and then talking about whether you're away from whether you are proceeding towards a depressive transition, whether you're in a healthy state where something needs to be observed, and so on. So that is, of course, the long-term goal, to look at real-time predictions.
Interesting. There is one more question in the chat from G.Ambika.
Yeah.
The person writes, are there repeated episodes of depression for the same person? Can they be detected?
No. So as in, we don't know yet. So in this sample, all we have is none of the individuals that we've measured have had more than one transition. And that's because we've only observed them for about 6 months. But this would be fairly relevant in different kinds of data sets, like when you have rapid cycling in other kinds of disorders, like bipolar disorder, which is something that my group is working on as well. Over there, this would be an interesting question, whether there are some people for whom transitions, you can detect transitions towards depression, and some people, and for some people for whom you can't do this. So I think that's a fairly relevant question, and maybe it can be answered in a slightly different sample.
Cool. Let us all thank you again, Sandip, for his amazing talk. It feels very strange just to clap on my own. Cool. Talk number 3 is by Alessandro. Please take it away. You are also on mute.
You hear me?
Okay. Yes.
Okay, I have a recorded talk. I'm trying to share the screen. Good evening to everybody. Oops, sorry. Can I start?
Please go ahead.
Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Let me start.
Good evening to everybody. In this talk, I'm going to present a new mathematical model in order to show if and how sortition, that is the random selection of people, could help representative democracy. This work has been done in collaboration with Maurizio Caserta, Andrea Rapisarda, and Salvatore Spagano, all from Catania University. Today, most people think that the democracy means elections and believe that only the electoral mechanism and the party system could ensure representativeness in democracy. But in the first significant democratic experience, the Athenian democracy, parties did not exist at all, and random selection of legislators, called sortition, was largely adopted. Many other cities in the history used some kind of lot as an effective method to hinder factionalism, such as Bologna, Parma, Vicenza, San Marino, Barcelona, and some parts of Switzerland. Lot was also used in Florence, 13th and 14th century, and in Venice for about 500 years, starting from the half of the 13th century. More recent proposals involve randomly selected popular juries for controlling the work of politicians, a radical reform of the House of Lords by random elections, or like what happened in Iceland, the review of the constitution in a unique experiment of direct democracy that involved 1,000 of randomly chosen Icelanders. Our work tries to further support the idea of random selection in politics, proposing a scientific approach. In particular, we propose to explore, through a mathematical model, how the efficiency of a modern parliament with two parties or coalitions may be affected by the introduction of a given percentage of legislators who are not elected but randomly selected among the candidates, and for this reason independent from the influence of parties. In order to do this, we should address some fundamental issues: how to model a parliament, how to define and calculate its efficiency, how it is possible to demonstrate that the introduction of a given number of independent legislators is able to increase such an efficiency. To answer these questions, in 2011, we presented an agent-based model of a virtual parliament defined in a two-dimensional opinion space, showing through extended numerical simulation that it is actually possible to calculate the optimal number of independent members able to maximize the efficiency of the parliament. In the present work, recently published in Physica A, we each change approach and try to confirm the results of our previous paper by proposing an analytical model of parliament defined in a one-dimensional opinion space. In this model, the n legislators are represented as points on the horizontal y-axis defined in the interval -1 + 1, and they are grouped in two parties or coalitions: majority party pi1 and the opposition or minority party pi2. In the limit of many legislators, their distribution in the two parties can be considered as a Gaussian, with unitary area, with a given mean randomly chosen but fixed during a legislature, and with a standard deviation sigma, which is the same for both the parties. During a given legislature L, each legislator can perform only two actions: submitting a bill or a proposal for approval, and voting in favor or against any bill. For simplicity, we assume that each legislator puts forward the same number of proposals. The position of each proposal on the y-axis represents the social gain ensured by the proposal and coincides with the position of the legislator who advanced it. This means that the proposals follow the same Gaussian distribution of the party to which the proposing member belongs. When a certain legislator belonging, for example, to the majority party has to vote a given proposal P star with abscissa Y star, we must consider the following two possible situations. If P star is an internal proposal coming from another member of the majority party, it is always accepted by the legislator due to party discipline. If P star is an external proposal coming from a member of the opposition party, it is accepted only if a Y star is greater than the party mean, which represents, this is important, the minimum social gain that the proposal should ensure to be accepted by legislators of the majority party. Moreover, if this condition is fulfilled due to internal motivation or personal interest, the legislator will vote only 1/2 of all the proposal. That is, he will vote them with a probability of 0.5. Of course, a given proposal is accepted by Parliament if it receives votes from the half plus 1 of the total number of legislators. In the figure, you can see a couple of examples of legislatures, each with different positions of the two parties. The dark blue areas in the Gaussian distribution represents the fraction of accepted proposals coming from the opposition party. Averaging the positions of the parties over many legislatures, both the Gaussian distribution will be centered at y equals 0. We will always assume such a limit in the following analytical considerations. Finally, let us define the global efficiency of a legislature as the product of the percentage of accepted proposals times their average social gain. In the limit of many terms, we can expect that the global efficiency will be the product of the previous two quantities, averaged over all the legislatures. Okay, the aim of this study is to show how the expected global efficiency change if a given number of randomly selected independent legislators, free of any party discipline, are introduced in the parliament in place of parties' members. Considering firstly a parliament with only the two parties, a majority P1 with 60% of members and an opposition P2 with 40%, we can evaluate separately the two factors in the efficiency, assuming a standard deviation of 0.15. Notice that the percentage of accepted proposals is quite high, while the average social gain is relatively low. The resulting global efficiency is therefore given by their product, and this is relatively low too, equal to 4.8%. The opposite case is a parliament with only independent members, whose distribution, in the limit of many legislatures, can be assumed as uniform. Being not subjected to any party discipline, each legislator will vote a given proposal with abscissa y star only if his position y is smaller than y star. But due to his personal interests, will vote only 1/2 of the proposals fulfilling this condition. Therefore, it is evident that none of the proposals, not even those with a very high social gain, will be able to reach the majority of votes to be accepted. Then the global efficiency, in this case, will be 0. Considering the more general case with both parties and independent legislators in the parliament, of course, the number of seats reserved to parties members will be calculated by taking out the seats of independents and distributing the remaining ones following the usual percentage of 60 and 40%. This means that above a given threshold of independence, the majority party can lose its absolute majority and become a relative majority party. Let us focus first on the votes received by positive proposals, those with y greater than 0, which represent the 50% of the total. In the limit of many legislatures, both parties are centered at y equals 0. Thus, positive proposals will be accepted by 100% of the members of the party proposing them and by 50% of the members of the other party. On the other hand, the positive proposals should be accepted also by 1/2 of the independent legislator with y less than 0. However, from the point of view of independent legislators, the average social gain of the positive proposal is the middle point of the positive part of the y-axis. Thus, the 37.5% of independent members will vote these proposals. Coming to the negative proposals, they can be accepted only if come from majority party P1, as long as this party maintains the absolute majority. In fact, from the rule of the model, negative proposals coming from P2 cannot be accepted. The same rules also imply that neither positive nor negative proposals coming from independent legislators can be accepted, no matter how many of them sit in parliament. Summarizing all these considerations, we report in the same graph how the percentage of votes received on average by positive and negative proposals decreases as function of an increasing percentage of independents introduced in the parliament. As you can see, 3 thresholds can be evaluated, which identify 4 intervals in the percentage of independents. Positive proposals coming from the relative majority party P1 are accepted until the percentage of independent legislators in the parliament stays below 70%. This is the threshold theta CD on the right. Positive proposals coming from the relative minority party P2 are accepted until the percentage of independent legislators in the parliament stays below 61%. This is the threshold theta BC. Finally, when P1 loses the absolute majority, its negative proposals, on average, can still be accepted due to the contribution of 1/2 of independent legislators, who represents the 12.5% of the total. This happens until the percentage of independent legislators in the parliament stays below 21%. This is the threshold theta AB. Okay, by imposing all the conditions on the number of votes, it is easy to obtain the general analytical expressions of these three thresholds as function of n and for any size p of the majority party. The behavior as function of p is shown in this figure. It is also possible to analytically derive the percentage of accepted proposals and their average social gain in each one of the 4 regions, which in turn allow us to calculate the expected average global efficiency inside the same regions. The plots below show that the efficiency starts to increase for small values of the percentage of independents present in the parliament. Then it reaches a maximum, which is independent on the size P of the majority party. And finally, it decreases for a number of independent members. This is again the global efficiency plotted in the wall allow the range of the percentage of independent members for 4 different values of the size of the majority party. And this is the position of the maximum of global efficiency as function of P. As you can see, it stays constant at 34% of independent legislators until the size of the majority party stays below 56.5%. Then it jumps to 14% and slowly increases with P. In conclusion, our analytical results for the one-dimensional model of a mixed parliament corroborates the numerical results obtained with the previous two-dimensional model, confirming that an intermediate percentage between about 15% and 35% of legislators, independent from the two parties and not subjected to any party discipline, are able to always improve the efficiency of the system, regardless the size of the majority party. This can suggest a practical implementation of our results that could be related with the problem of the increasing level of abstention. For example, one could think to offer 2 alternative options to those citizens who are typically oriented towards abstention. Each of them going to the polls during the election day could choose whether to vote for a party candidate or enroll in a list for a sortition. Then, after the elections, a percentage of seats proportional to the level of abstentionism would be reserved to randomly selected citizens picked out from the list of candidates. We could also think about the system of frequent rotation to prevent factionalism, so that the new independent legislators could be selected at random from the original sortition list for each single parliamentary session, devoted to a specific issue. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Alessandro. Really interesting. There is already a question in the chat. Can you see that, or should I read it up for you?
Let me the chat. Maybe I don't know if I enable. Maybe I should put off the screen.
Yeah, you can turn it off or stop sharing it.
Yes. I'm still sharing.
Yes, you're still sharing.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Now I can see the chat. Okay. Have you considered the personal gain and social gain being correlated? No, in this model, we don't consider this correlation because we made some kind of correlation in our first work in 2011, and it was a two-dimensional model in the opinion space because actually the two axes represented exactly these two, this personal gain and social gain. So it was a model, but it was too difficult to be analyzed with an analytical approach. So we reduced the complexity, putting only the social gain in the y-axis and assuming that due to personal interest, just 1/2 of the proposals will be accepted by an individual. So there is no correlation. This is a fixed threshold. Another talk, the cost for being independent, no, is not a cost in the sense that the cost is that, of course, the probability that in 1 million, millions of people in the list that you are selected by chance, of course, is very low. But this could be a cost, but also could be an opportunity because you can be selected very rarely, and if you are selected, as I explained at the end of the talk, you could enter in the parliament just for discussing one proposal. So you have not to leave your job and so on. So it's very few investment of time for a citizen, but all the citizens could participate to the public choice.
Thank you so much. The time is up, unfortunately.
Okay.
Maybe you can answer them in the chat if you have time.
Okay.
That would be great.
Thank you very much.
Let's all thank Alessandro again.
Thank you. Bye.
And I want to introduce our next speaker. It's Samin as well. Please take it ahead.
Hello, everyone. Also, my presentation is pre-recorded. I'm going to share my screen and broadcast it. Just before that, I'd like to just mention, it was very interesting to me how similar is the result of Alessandro's work and the presentation I'm going to give, which is, I think, kind of different. It's substantive rather than analytical, but it's very interesting to find common results in such a diverse session. All right, so I'm going to play it now. I hope that
Hi, I'm Samin Aref from National Institute for Demographic Research, and today with Zachary Neal from Michigan State University, we're going to talk to you about analyzing polarization and clusterability in sign networks of political collaboration. So here on the slide, you see the increase in polarization in the US Congress. So you see that both for the House of Representatives and the Senate, over time, the ideological scores, which are referred to as DW nominate, for the two main parties in the US Congress show an increasing divide. So you can see that in more recent sessions, in more recent years, the distribution of the ideologies have shifted, so Democrats to the left and Republicans to the right, and in more recent years there's less overlap. As you may imagine, there are different ways for doing this sort of analysis. In the classic approach, it only involves party membership and DW nominate scores, and it doesn't need any sort of network analysis. But this approach assumes that there is homogeneity within party and heterogeneity between parties. In a previous work, we used collaboration networks of legislators. These are signed networks where nodes are legislators and the edges represent whether two legislators significantly collaborate with each other or significantly avoid each other in terms of bill co-sponsorship. And we use this network and the concept of structural balance, which I'm going to explain later, to look at the party membership of the optimal coalitions in these networks. You may get more information from this QR code. But in the work I'm going to present now, what we're doing is using collaboration networks of legislators and the concept of weak balance, which is more flexible than structural balance, and we also make use of the DW nominate ideological scores. So I'm going to first discuss where these collaboration networks come from, and then explain the concepts of structural balance and weak balance and how we optimally partition these networks. Then we move on to the results. Here you see two legislators from US House of Representatives, Earl Blumenauer and Sheila Jackson Lee. So for our method of analysis, we construct networks where these legislators are nodes of the network. And the question here is, what is the edge between these two legislators? So we use sign networks for our modeling, and there are two types of edges, positive edges and negative edges. So one may assume that as these legislators are both Democrats, their edge must have a positive sign, but actually for inferring signs of the edges, we look at the data from bill co-sponsorship. So these two individuals have co-sponsored 242 bills together in the recent session of the US House of Representatives. And here you see the distribution of the number of bills that they would have co-sponsored together if each legislator randomly chooses which bills to co-sponsor. So essentially, this is a null model to evaluate the number of bills that these legislators have co-sponsored. Based on this null model, the actual number of bills that these people have co-sponsored is clearly much less than what is expected by chance. And because of this, we consider a negative tie between these two legislators. We use bipartite data for creating these networks. So these bipartite data are essentially telling us who has co-sponsored which bill. And we have these data for both chambers of the US Congress for 20 sessions or 20 waves. So for networks of US House of Representatives, we have something around 435 nodes. And for networks of US Senate, we have something around 100 nodes. We use the R package backbone for creating these networks. This involves extracting the backbone of these bipartite data. And here you see the main commands of this package, which is available from CRAN. So what we're doing here is essentially making a hypothesis testing for every pair of legislators. And if the number of bills they have co-sponsored is more than what is in the null model, then an edge with a positive weight is created between them, which represent statistically significant level of collaboration. And if the number of bills they have co-sponsored, if lower than what is expected by chance, then a negative edge is created between them, which represents a statistically significant level of avoidance. And as you may see, we're essentially making these tests for each pair of legislators. That's why this process requires conducting a large number of multiple independent hypothesis testing. And because of this, we need to control for the family-wise error by applying a Holm-Bonferroni adjustment. All right, now that we know how the networks are created, let's move on to the difference between structural balance and weak balance, which is the main methodology behind our analysis of these networks. So according to structural balance theory, if a signed network could be partitioned into two clusters such that positive edges are within the clusters and negative edges are between the clusters, it is structurally balanced. And we have a similar definition for a weakly balanced network or a K-balanced network according to Davis from 60s. And based on this definition, a network is K-balanced if the same condition is satisfied when we partition the network into K groups, which could be more than two. I'm going to tell you more about the differences between structural balance and weak balance using this example. So in this example sign graph, dotted lines are negative edges and solid lines are positive edges. In order to analyze this network based on structural balance, we need to optimally partition the nodes into two groups or two coalitions, such that the number of positive edges between the two groups and the number of negative edges within the groups is minimized. And according to this optimal partitioning that you see, the only edge that is not consistent is the edge 4, 5, because it's negative and within a coalition. And according to this analysis, we can say that the two clusterability index of this network is 1. It means that when we optimally cluster this network into two groups, there is one edge that is inconsistent with the assumptions of clustering. But we can also make use of weak balance, which is more flexible, and it allows us to optimally partition this network into more than two groups. So in here, the optimal partitioning gives 3 groups. And according to this optimal partitioning, the 3 clusterability index is 0, meaning that if we cluster the nodes into 3 groups, there wouldn't be any edges inconsistent with the assumptions of clustering. That's why this network is considered K-balanced for the value of K being equal to 3. So what we're going to do with networks of legislators is partitioning them based on different values of K, starting from 2, then 3, and then seeing the number of inconsistent edges or the number of frustrated edges. And the partitioning that is associated with a smaller value of frustrated edges or inconsistent edges would be more suitable for the structure of the network under analysis. Now let's move on to the results on K clusterability index for networks of legislators. Here on this plot, we see on the x-axis the number of clusters and on the y-axis the K clusterability index. As you can see, when we use 2 clusters, we have 8 frustrated edges, but as soon as we use 3, the number of frustrated edges is reduced to 1. So we see a decline between going with 2 clusters as opposed to 3 clusters. And then if we use more clusters for this network, which is the 96th session of the Senate, we have 0 frustrated edges, meaning that the network is weakly balanced for K being equal to 4, 5, and larger values. Here is the cumulative K-clusterability index now on the y-axis, and the part that you see in orange color is for the 97 session of the network. Again, we see the same pattern that for using 2 clusters, we have 6 frustrated edges, but when we use 3 clusters, the number of frustrated edges declines to 2. We see all the results for all sessions of the US Senate on this plot. We see that there's a sharp decline when we go from 2 clusters to 3 clusters, followed by a slower decline between 3 and 4. If we pay attention closely, there's also some decrease between 4 and 5. And then when we use 5 clusters all the way to 10 clusters, the number of frustrated edges remains the same. And eventually, when we force the algorithm to use 20 clusters, we actually see an increase in the number of frustrated edges, or in the inconsistency of the partitioning to that specific network.
In this slide, you see ideology reported by political party. This is the traditional approach used in political science and does not rely on any network data. As you might expect, the Democrats, marked by blue, generally have a left-leaning ideology, while the Republicans, marked in red, generally have a right-leaning ideology. This plot also illustrates ideology. However, in this case, aggregated into 2 coalitions identified by our algorithm as the optimal 2 clustering of a signed graph. The blue coalition has a left-leaning ideology and is composed mostly of Democrats, but also includes some Republicans. The red coalition has a right-leaning ideology and is composed mostly of Republicans, but also includes some Democrats. In the most recent sessions, political parties and coalitions have converged, so this plot looks similar to the plot on the previous slide. However, in earlier sessions, the plots differed, highlighting that in the 1980s and early 1990s, the right-leaning coalition included members with more diverse ideologies than it does today. This plot is similar, however, aggregates legislators into 3 coalitions, identified by our algorithm as the optimal 3 clustering of a signed graph. This is similar to imagining the US Congress as organized in a 3-party system rather than a 2-party system. We can still observe polarized left and right-leaning coalitions. However, the 3rd coalition's ideological position is less stable. For example, in the 111th House, there was a dominant liberal coalition and a smaller center-left coalition, while in the 108th House, there was a dominant conservative coalition and a smaller center-right coalition. So what does this all mean? Well, at this point, these are preliminary findings, and we're not entirely sure. We'd welcome your feedback and suggestions, but we think we're seeing evidence that legislative collaborations in the United States Congress look more like a parliamentary 3-coalition system than a simpler 2-party system. However, that system is unstable. The 3rd coalition can be far left, or center left, or center right, and even in some sessions can be trivially small. However, it looks like most often this 3rd coalition is ideologically liberal. This is important because it means that the 3rd coalition may diminish the strength of the dominant liberal coalition.
Here are some references, and we welcome your feedback and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samin. Any questions? Well, I have a question.
Sure.
So this is interesting. What do you think are the next steps? Are you gonna bring in more data, or where are you going with this?
Yeah, so the main finding was that as opposed to the conventional assumption that the political system in the US is mainly made up of 2 components, one being the liberals, one being the conservatives, we see evidence that this is not the case, and there is a 3rd group, and this 3rd group, you can think of it as a 3rd wheel, or as a group of residuals that don't belong to any of the first 2 groups. Now we're looking at the legislative effectiveness of these 3 groups. So for liberals and Democrats, the results, which I have not mentioned in the talk, are as it is expected. When liberals have the majority, their effectiveness is higher, and the same for conservatives. But for the case of this third residual group, this third coalition, while they are made up of, they are people who are not collaborating with others, in some sense, they have a higher effectiveness, meaning that it seems like like avoiding the partisan divide is increasing the legislative effectiveness, which was kind of similar to the result that Alessandro presented just before me. So yeah, the next step is looking at effectiveness of this three component system.
Cool, thank you so much. So we're supposed to have a fifth talk now by Nelson Fernández, but unfortunately they have withdrawn their talk. So Samin, you can answer one more question. There's a question,
Sure.
One more in the chat. Otherwise, we'll go for a break and we'll see each other again in like 15 minutes. So please go ahead.
Yes, so the question is from Joanna. Well, first of all, happy to see you virtually, Joanna, here. So I'm reading the question out loud. Do you think this third group appears as a consequence of the increase in polarization, or is a reminiscent of previously less polarized time? So yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure how we have this third group, but it exists both in in recent sessions and in sessions from 1970s and 80s. In terms of polarization, the existence of this third group means that the system is not as polarized as we would think if we force a two partitioning algorithm on it. So when we analyze the system based on classical balance, we see that the system is very polarized. There are two groups, but as soon as we allow the algorithm to give us potentially a third group, it produces that third group, and the difference is substantial, meaning that the three group partitioning is more natural for the structure of this system. So in a sense, this three component system is also polarized, but polarized into three poles, if that makes sense, because this third group is a group of legislators who are avoiding both the main liberal coalition and the main conservative coalition. So I think it's a new dimension on polarization, and polarization into three. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you so much. I'm just gonna clap again. So as I said before, the next speaker has withdrawn their talk. So we will continue again at 18 o'clock, which basically 6 p.m. GMT time. So that's in around 12 minutes. Thank you all. Otherwise, go to the bathroom, enjoy yourself, open a beer, whatever you prefer.
Thanks, everyone. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Dear all, so the speaker for the next talk has not showed up. Let's just give the person 2 to 3 more minutes. Otherwise, I think the person might not show up at all, since they're also related to the previous talk. And then we might just end early. But let's just give them 2 more minutes to show up. Thank you. So for those of you who just joined now, the speaker has not showed up for the talk. We're just giving them some time. Otherwise, we will sort of close down this session. Thank you all for your patience. So I don't think the speaker will show up for the last talk, unfortunately. So I will just end this session here today. Thank you all for participating, and hopefully see you all again tomorrow. Thank you all so much. Cool. Thanks, Michal and Maria. Yep. Take care.